Are you really buying a car online on AutoTrader right now?
Really, I can get super specific with dealer listings and see cars based on my budget.
Mom! You can really have it delivered.
Or pick it up.
Mommy, look! I think your kid is walking up the slide.
Really? AutoTrader. Buy your car online. Really?
Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. And today I'm joined by our friend Jacob Renica. And we've decided today to talk about smaller than average folk. The fantasy trope about having the small people, like hobbits, but not just hobbits, and what happens when fantasy takes that direction. So the first thing I suppose we're asking ourselves as fantasy creatives is, what is happening? What is the potential that you give yourself as a writer when you start playing around with scale? And I've come up with a few concepts for this. So, Jacob, I'm going to throw at you my first one, which is, I think that small usually means vulnerable or childlike. Would you agree that that's a sort of common outcome if you choose to go small?
Yeah, no, I definitely do. You see that in things like Gulliver's Travels, right? Where somebody's kind of forced, I guess, especially when a character is forced into a situation where they're suddenly smaller than they're used to be. So there's certainly something about, kind of a challenging one's place in the world, and kind of opening one up to seeing things from a more vulnerable a position, a station, if you will. So I absolutely agree. It kind of seems to pull the rug out from under you and puts you in a position of vulnerability and hope. I think the hope is humility, but oftentimes it takes a while for the characters to get to that point.
It could be the lesson they learn, of course. But I was thinking exactly. Where you've got small characters within cultures where they are relatively smaller than everyone else. So classic situation, the hobbits with men and elves. And I was struck, I went at the weekend to hear The Two Towers done as an orchestral performance at the Royal Albert Hall, which is a fabulous thing. If you ever get a chance to see the film played with a live orchestra and choir, it's amazing. But one of the lines that came up to me in that film version, which is from the books, which is Aragorn saying to Éomer, trying to describe the hobbits. He says, they're small, they're like children in your eyes. And I think that's really the dynamic with the hobbits, is that they are, in a way, the thing that has to be protected. Traditionally, that was your damsel in distress. But because there is a lack of female characters, as we all know, I think in a way the hobbits fulfill that function as the Fellowship gathers around them to protect them. And there is something about them being small, which makes them even more precious, not in the sense of the ring, but everyone feels more of a duty of care, shall we say, to the hobbits than they would have otherwise. So say if some warrior like Aragorn is carrying the ring, the dynamic changes instantly. Whereas with the hobbits, you immediately get this desire to protect, which I think is a really interesting way of getting across that role that very often is given to a child, or back in the day to a woman. And the hobbits are doing that job, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, that's a great. I love that line. Though they would only be, children to your eyes. So there's something that from their perspective, they don't see themselves as children, but from people from other situations, it's this through the lens of the other, and in that case, right, the protector. So I think that so eliciting something about someone who is smaller that elicits in someone who's larger and more able. That kind of elicits a desire to protect. Yeah. So I think that's a great dynamic.
And it led me to thinking about that thing you've just said about they're not small in their own eyes. They're perfectly to scale in Hobbiton. Hobbiton is made for them. Yeah. And it made me think of some of the animal characters in the Narnia series, particularly Reepicheep, who is a brave captain amongst, he takes no prisoners. He wants to be out there fighting with everybody. And yet there is the humor that he is a mouse, but a formidable mouse. And you get it in Puss in Boots as well in the version of those stories that DreamWorks have done, the comedy of the small warrior. So that's another line in this where we see them as being more vulnerable, but they're also very proud of their own status and defensive of their status. So there's a comedic potential when someone who's small thinks they're enormous, I suppose, is one way of putting it.
Right. Got the Napoleon syndrome.
Yeah, well, not so much though, because by their own lights, they are, of course. Reepicheep is a perfectly ordinary sized mouse. So amongst his comrades, he's got nothing to apologize for. He's probably quite a tall mouse. I don't know.
Right.
Like a tail at one point. So moving on for the potential, we've got sort of the vulnerability and the sort of comedy and emotions around that. I think you've already mentioned Gulliver's Travel, and that brings us to another big thing, which is the possibility for satire. How do you see the satire playing? Because Gulliver's Travel has set up the sort of satire potential of scale really for the rest of literature going forward from there.
Yeah, it's a work of satire, right? And like looking at the world from different angles, from forcing a different perspective upon you, and where you're right. So if you think that your assumption is I am the norm, I am the standard size, this is what the universe was constructed around, was on me being this size and in this position and station in life, and then either really amplifying that, right? So when Gulliver's visit, he's visiting the Lilliputians, right? So they're small and he's to scale. He's much larger, but there's certain things that he's forced to reckon with himself, and is being even larger better, or is there's the whole number of problems that come into play there. But then when he's also the scale shifts there, and he's smaller, so it's really, again, I think I mentioned this idea of like challenging your assumptions, and usually perspective of being the center of the universe. That there's something about forcing a change size-wise that requires people to shift the way that they view the world itself.
Yeah,
and you see that. I mean, you see that in Silverchair, right? Where they visit, right, the land of the giants, and just in terms of like their size, they're trying to figure out these cracks in the ground that turn out to be a large message, that when to scale, that you could see actually what the entire message says, but they just think these are chasms in the ground, and the giants, they're obviously being kind of taken advantage of because of their smaller size. But the narrator gives us a little bit more perspective a little later, and they themselves understand, once they have a little bit of distance, they're able to see what the message was, that due to their size and proximity to that, they weren't able to grasp fully before, and the situation itself that they weren't able to understand. It took kind of like a little bit of distance to see that. So
yeah, they also play up on their size, don't they, when they realize that they're basically being fattened for the pot.
Right.
And Jill plays up at being the little cutie to enable them to get the opportunity to escape and all that, and manipulating the giants. Not so much a satire there, but it's just making use of the scale. Another place where it is a satire in famous fantasy literature, of course, is The Time Machine. In the future, where humanity has become separated into two kinds of races, a kind of hulking underground race and a sort of ethereal, thin overground race. And it's as though the traits within humanity have been pushed apart. And that is definitely a commentary on the development of society at the time H.G. Wells was writing Industrialization, the Industrial Worker. and all sorts of things. So a clever way of looking at the sort of dystopian future, the sort of future casting that goes on there. So yeah, satire is definitely there. And then one thing, which I think should not be forgotten, is the whimsy that you have if you go small. And I was thinking here of books like the Borrowers series. I don't know if that's well known in the US. It's about a miniature family who so they cobble together their environment from like matchboxes and safety pins, and they go to sea in on the river in a little boat. It was made into a BBC TV series over here, so it's quite well known as a sort of my era children's book. And there was, of course, Mrs. Pepperpot, which was another delightful series where Mrs. Pepperpot gets shrunk, a bit like the Tom Thumb story. So there's the whimsy to that, to suddenly seeing the world and how the world would appear if you were but a couple of inches high. And that led me to thinking about Beatrix Potter, because in a way, majority of her stories, particularly things like The Tale of Two Bad Mice, is definitely showing the whimsy of scale. So the mice, Hunca Munca, and the other one, Thomasina? No, that's the name of one of the dolls. Anyway, I've forgotten. Hunca Munca, I definitely remember as the name. They move into the doll's house in the nursery and then get very annoyed that the fires aren't real and that the plaster food is actually not edible, and they start smashing it all up. I loved that story as a child because I could really relate to this thing of the disappointment of it not being real, and the idea of the mice moving into what is your playhouse. So there's this whimsy, and that connected thought in much more of the current generation. It led me to thinking about Ant-Man. Have you seen the first Ant-Man film?
Yes, I've seen all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, of course, you've got a kiddie, so of course you're going to see all of them. Yeah. But I absolutely adored the way the big finale happened on a train set. I was much more interested in the hilarity of seeing like Thomas the Tank Engine being used as one of the big set piece things at that scale, like the miniature world. And I thought that was just wonderful. And that's what Ant-Man should be doing, in my view. Is that uses that scale thing to whimsical advantage. Have you got any other favorite, perhaps over in the US, miniature people stories, which I and European listeners might not be aware of?
There's the one that comes to mind is in part the scale, but it's also in terms of the nature of the being, and that is the Indian in the Cupboard series. This is kind of a precursor. So it's, in the vein of like Velveteen Rabbit, where an animal, or like a Toy Story, where toys actually have feelings, thoughts, some sort of inner life. And Indian Cupboard series, follows the adventures and misadventures of these small figures, as little cowboys and Indians, as they're referred to, and what happens when the doors are closed, when the children are away, that sort of thing. So that's another one area and you see that in like the Toy Story films. It's really accessible. That it's in part it's their size. You see the world, like the camera is entirely from their angle, right? So what does it look like? Under the bed is their norm, right? Where the dust bunnies and everything are. So that's their odds and ends that have rolled under the bed. Like that's their geography. So it's interesting. Yeah. So seeing the world from that perspective, and how silly some things seem when you're pointed, when you're on the ground, kind of pointing up, seeing what things other people are concerned with, that people that are kind of closer to the ground and smaller don't seem to be as concerned about. That's something they definitely see satirically used in some of those films.
That, of course, thank you for mentioning Toy Story, because that would have been a big gap if we'd forgotten that. I love how the the little plastic soldiers all move, like they can't move their legs separately because they're on those.
Right, they're just going to waddle.
Waddle in. The detail of that is so charming, but because you're convinced by that world as being a complete world, it doesn't mean it's low stakes. The stakes there are high about survival, friendship, being separate, finding your way home. They're all big stakes, but within a small world.
And sometimes the stakes are higher because you're smaller, right? So I'm reminded of the film Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and not so much the sequels, but right. So it's changing perspective, right? So you're shrunk, and so something that seems just everyday, ordinary, like the sprinkler going off, like that could have disastrous effects on these children who are, the size of the head of a pin. These drops of water become deadly projectiles.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's then that film is great. I'm saying like every day, like what does it look like to be an ant, like, or something that usually you might want to step on or might be a nuisance, how a small creature you can connect with and can actually help if given an opportunity to. So there's lots of things that you can do, again, with that kind of shift in perspective and make you look at the world and reevaluate your assumptions about something. Is it valuable? Is it trash? Is this worth discarding? Is it something that should be valorized? All of those are questions that when you shift perspective, they really raise those questions.
Okay. And so the last thing I thought of, and do come up with any more in this line, the last thing I think that's happening is about access. So you get if you go small, you get access to worlds which you would otherwise not be able to see. So you mentioned like the ant colony. So that reminds me of films like Ants, for example. And then there's the traditional tale of the ant and the grasshopper. So you get access to little worlds that you wouldn't otherwise see. Ant and grasshopper, of course, is another satire. So they can do more than one thing at the same time. But I was thinking particularly of Alice in Wonderland, because that is one of the most famous scenes of shrinking and, changing scale. That there's the idea of going through the small door to this magical world. And if only you get it right, that idea of a secret access, if you get to be small enough to slip through down the rabbit hole, again, it presumably means rabbit holes aren't person size. So there's a sense of access there. And that leads me to think of the films where, I can't remember the name of the film, but I remember watching it where they shrink to go inside a human body. So
that's Inner Space. There's an episode of the Magic School Bus that does the same thing, but it was done. Yeah. There's a Martin Short film called Inner Space. Yeah. Where they shrunk down and it accidentally injected, or purposefully, I can't remember which one, it was injected into somebody. So you're seeing the human body from the inside and the perils of being microscopic. Yeah. Yeah.
So again, it gives you access to this new world. It's a kind of portal in a way by going small. And I think all of this is joined together by the idea that in fantasy, what you're doing by scale is reframing whatever is your ordinary world by changing the scale. It becomes a commentary on the ordinary world. Okay, so let's go back in time and work out when people first started doing this. Any thoughts on that? What's the earliest small scale story that you could think of? I've got a couple of ones I came up with.
Yeah, this is a great question in terms of like world mythologies. Typically, I mean, in like the Mediterranean, Greco-Roman, which is interesting in and of itself, is that there isn't an emphasis on small creatures usually, right? So it's on large scale or standard size, and sometimes the humans are dwarfed by the scale of some of these monstrous creatures. So, for example, right, in the Odyssey, right? So you have the Cyclops, and it's that humans are the ones, like they're kind of consistently put in their place, or they're kind of diminished when set against the gods or some of these larger forces of nature. It's something similar happening in Egyptian mythology. Middle Eastern mythologies, there doesn't seem to be much of an emphasis on small creatures. It's more is a creature ethereal or not, but the scale, they don't seem to be terribly concerned about scale from that perspective, although you do have emphasis on certain animals.
I think it comes in animal tales, doesn't it? So something like Aristophanes, the frogs, using it for comedic purposes.
Right.
Are you really buying a car online on AutoTrader right now?
Really?
At a playground?
Yeah, really. Look at these listings from dealers.
Wow, your search can really get that specific.
Really?
And you just put in your info and boom, car's in your budget.
Mom needs a second, honey.
You can really have it delivered?
Really? Or I can pick it up at the dealership. Mom! 1 sec, sweetie. Mommy's buying a car.
Mommy, look!
I think your kid is walking up the slide.
Kyle, again? Really?
AutoTrader. Buy your car online. Really?
But I think you're right. I think where you go to find small people is probably over into, again, this is if people out there listening are coming up with, there's obviously this, do let us know, because we can learn. But I was thinking that the classic little people of the hills that you get from the sort of Celtic northern stories, and of course in the Viking world you've got dwarves. Hooray, here enter the dwarves. So the little people, doing the Celtic thing first, obviously the little people, the diminutive there, that's a whole mixture. So the other folk, the Sith, you do get the sort of tall, elven, dangerous folk that are the precursors to Tolkien's elves, but you do have a whole kind of realm of the household spirits and sprites that have a diminutive aspect to them. The pixies, the brownies, the leprechauns, of course, you mustn't forget leprechauns, which then lead into folk figures like Puck and Robin Goodfellow, those things. And they're very much more of a domestic level. They're interfering in the household. They're making the milk go sour. Or in that wonderful Elves and the Shoemaker story, which is that a Hans Christian Andersen story? I think feels like one.
Probably.
But it's probably picking up on an older tradition of the idea that your housework might be done if you leave out a reward. Wishful thinking there. Wish it worked. So there is this figures which then became used again and again in the sort of Victorian fairy tale tradition and the 18th century tradition, were definitely from that kind of fairy tale folkloric inheritance of the little people in the hills. That's where I see it strongly in our own culture. And they're not spirits. So it's different from the idea of a ghost or something else that might have like a frailty to it. They're another kind of creature. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, that it is like has physicality to it. It's not, it's not incorporeal, but it's corporeal, but it's so small or elusive that you can't see it. So like functionally, it's functioning like a ghost, a spirit of some sort, because you can't see it unless you're, the same thing with ghosts. You can only see it if you're catch it almost unaware or at the right time or under very particular circumstances. So yeah, that is interesting. And that there is really, it seems to be in the, kind of, the traditions in the British Isles, the little people are largely kind of, in some cases, agents of chaos, right? So they're fickle, right? And that's where you see in J.M. Barrie, how J.M. Barrie depicts fairies, is they only have enough room for one emotion at a time. And it's either, they're either angry or they're happy. And so it's going to flip a switch because they don't have room for more complex emotions. So it seems that kind of seems to be a trend in those stories about little people, is they're either angry, livid, terribly offended, or they're happy-go-lucky, cheerful, and, singing songs all the time. Until you say the wrong thing, and then they hate you, and you're 4 generations beyond you.
Yes, because the Tinkerbell character in Peter Pan, obviously J.M. Barrie is inheriting the whole Victorian building on this. But in that, she's very cruel at times.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a bit like it's sort of something animal or something very small child about that, the tantrum. And as you say, flipping the switch to be kind or helpful at different moments. Bit arbitrary in the way they react to things as well. That's where the chaos comes in.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, like, returning to the hobbits for a moment there, looking at the inner life of hobbits, right? So Tolkien depicts them, depicts them at least through the lens of the narrator, which is, if the Lord of the Rings is, kind of filtered through Frodo's lens. Looking at the hobbits, they're depicted with a very kind of simple life, right? So they don't have this kind of, they don't seem to be within their communities, don't seem to have like a really complex inner life of emotions, that they're simple. You see in the depiction of Hobbiton, right? They're happy-go-lucky, or they're angry, or the certain hobbits are angry. There's not much of a middle. Frodo kind of appears to be an anomaly there. But then he, kind of expands, his inner life certainly expands as he leaves that area where these other people kind of have these simple either or kind of desires. And as he gets out into the world and encounters different cultures that have different perspectives, and even just seeing that hobbits are not the norm, like that size is not the standard for which the rest of the scale on which the rest of the world functions. So I think you can kind of see echoes of that in the depiction of the hobbits as being just rather simple creatures. I don't know if that's tied to the size, and that if it's assumed that the larger you are, the more complex, the more room you have for emotions, but you don't have that in, say, the Odyssey, or once you get to an even larger scale, then those creatures are depicted as being sometimes buffoons, right? So kind of like typical giants, like in Harry Potter, right? So you have the giants are seen as kind of more foolish, and you see that kind of in Silverchair to a certain extent, and in Narnia larger, but they're not. You would imagine perhaps that if smaller creatures are more simple, then the larger you grow, the more complex you can become and smarter you can become. But really, there's a scale. There seems to be kind of this Goldilocks zone where if you're very small, maybe you're too simple, get to be a size of a human being, then that's kind of where you can figure things out. You're intelligent, but then once you get kind of larger, and the farther away you get from that, then kind of the more simplistic kind of like a return to that. So on either ends, either the giants and the very little people in some of these tales, that's where you lack complexity, and you're getting kind of to the extremes there. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at scale and what is significant and who actually has the intelligence in a situation. Yeah. Emotional intelligence, even.
I wonder if what's actually going on is that it's more of an Arcadian thing. That actually they're inheriting that idea of almost like a bucolic paradise that they're in, and a bit like in As You Like It or The Winter's Tale, the idea that somehow living in nature is more natural and therefore simpler. Because there aren't many hobbits with a drive for power, are there? There's a lot who there's a couple of bad eggs, but most people are not that corruptible. There's a few cowards, but they don't want to take over the world. Right. They're happy to stay within their limits. And even the hobbits are happy, the ones who go abroad, they come back relatively happy to stay within the limits that they've been given. So I wonder if it's that, because I think the hobbits are like an ideal person, as opposed to being, they are us. There are the way we relate to Middle Earth, because the other people beyond the borders of the Shire often feel more like mythic figures. They've got they speak in a more elevated language, and they've got long lineages, and they're so in a way the hobbits are us. They're an idealized version of English people, less without any empire at that era, I think, is how I read it. So we've been thinking about the sort of fairy tale aspect and the puck and the pixies and the leprechauns. I think there's also a connection here to the sort of world of toys. This is why I think scale is very often associated with children's fiction, and most of the examples we've come up with so far is definitely aimed at children. And of course, children are obsessed about how tall they are for a very good reason, because how you grow is really important, and it's remarked on all the time. And you personally are setting yourself, you're looking up to the adult world and wanting to join it or not join it, depending if you're Peter Pan. So you can see why it gets associated with children's fiction. But I think there's also an element of toys going on here. So it's like a kind of play. So children very often will play with dolls and soldiers and things, and manipulate them to tell stories. So I think there's that connection too, that a lot of the sort of fantasy involving this does come from that world. Like Barbie. We've just had Barbie film. Barbie is actually not, I don't know how Margot Robbie is, 5 something. 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", maybe. Barbie is that tall. And of course they're playing, that whole film revolved around us all understanding that the Barbie world is a small one.
Right.
With the play toys, the dog, the house, the boat, everything being the kind of thing you'd play with as a kid. But it also there was nothing much beyond beach and house.
Right.
The world is limited. And so I think that another place where we look at scale and tell stories is to do with toys.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that reminds me of the like the Lego movie.
Great
about
example.
Films, right? So another one. So completely so it has a consistent set of rules, scenario, culture, but then kind of at the end of the film, that's when things kind of step back larger, that you see like this is you have this is all a play world that is being created here. And how does that happen? And it's some of it's used satirically, but it's so there's very much that this is a world. The smaller world is a world in which sometimes anything is possible, and can sometimes show you the unnecessary limits that adults, standard sized people place on the world that you don't have in some of these smaller worlds. It's kind of almost a microcosm for imagination and the expansive nature of imagination, but you're doing it on the smaller scale. And so that's really, the lesson in a sense for Legos is that you can do anything. The possibilities are practically endless, or the number of combinations, the variety is endless. And the problems occur when you try to solidify, right? So using there it's the Craggle, the super glue. That's their super weapon. And so it's that rigidity that the father brings in to this world, is trying to establish order and just like kind of stasis, whereas the child wants to explore and play. And so this is a world where those kind of ideas of stasis and kind of transformation, change, exploration, where those are kind of pitted against each other, exploring again those concepts in our own life. But yeah, the scale, when we're talking about playing with toys, there's possibilities that are opened up that children have access to, because they're not as rigid in their way of this is what you use this object can only be used as, from like a toilet paper roll is meant for the trash. It's only meant to spool around toilet paper. Or could it be used as a telescope? It could be used as the top of a smokestack. It could be used as, and just, the possibilities are endless there. But it's on that kind of smaller scale that the children and the childlike have access to, that is kind of, I think, heightened in those sort of kind of smaller toy world settings.
I'd forgotten there, of course, there is the live action parts in Lego, the first Lego movie, isn't there? I'd forgotten that because I only remember I thought it was a brilliant film, very clever film, with the inventiveness. But of course, within the Lego world, everybody is the same size as each other. It's like,
right.
They're all, that is their world. So therefore that's the norm. But having that outer real world part of the story where we see it's being built and imagined by the child adds that meta level, which I think allows for the satire and the social comment and all these other things, which happens, of course, in the Barbie movie in more greater length, because she goes into the real world and goes out expecting it to be women in being able to realize their full potential, and finds it's a bit of a bro culture. Which Ken, I don't know if you've seen the film, but Ken takes that back into the Barbie world, having discovered, because he's been emasculated literally in the Barbie world. And that's where the comedy comes from. Anyway, so yeah, so there's a toy aspect here. And let's turn now to The Hobbit, which of course is why we're talking about this, because we were always, we tend to go back to thinking about Tolkien. In A Hole in the Ground There Lived a Hobbit was where he started. Though Tolkien did say that he was aware that perhaps one of the influences on thinking of these little creatures was from a book called The Land of the Snurgs by a writer called Wyke Smith, Wyke Smith, something like that. Wyke Smith, Wyke Smith. And that's not to say that he borrowed the idea from Wyke Smith, but I think it's more of a sense of this is one of the streams that he was, had gone into his imagination, one of the sources, because there are also lots of diminutive creatures in the George MacDonald books, which were one of the big fantasy writers of the Victorian period, Christina Rossetti in her poems. Very often it's a child interacting with these small creatures there. So the scale isn't so huge between the child and the creature. And I was also reminded of the Charles Kingsley book, Water Babies. I don't know if you ever read that. I read a sort of slightly bolderized version because I think it's very moralistic in an unacceptable Victorian way now. But it's I read a version of this with wonderful, I think it was Mabel Lucy Atwell illustrations, and that's the story of a chimney sweep who basically, I think he dies. I didn't realize this as a child, but he goes into the river and joins the world of the Water Babies, where everyone is washed clean, and it's a kind of very heavy-handed religious metaphor, but there's something quite magical about the world he joins of the Water Babies. I don't suppose they read it anymore, because actually when I think about it as an adult, I'm thinking, my goodness, what's really going on in that book? But anyway, the idea of there being this world that you go into to escape from a life of being a chimney sweep. So all of these must have been familiar to Tolkien, because it's very much a sort of cultural phenomenon of the sort of late Victorian period. So what do you think about the successful use of scale within The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings? Having thought of all the things we've been mentioning about vulnerability, satire, whimsy, access, what creative use is he making of scale?
Yeah, so you see, it's interesting. Yeah, it's a great question to see. It's interesting to see how the different characters react to the hobbits, right? So you start out in the world of the hobbits. This is kind of your natural setting, and then that world, individuals from that world are kind of thrust into this adventure, but then seeing how others who are not really familiar with them, right, because their culture has kind of been isolated, kind of purposefully so, just kind of minding their own business, like you were saying, like no real sense for drive or aspiration to colonize or really go beyond their own communities. And so seeing how the others, the lessons that the other characters learn from them, or in cases where larger characters underestimate what they're capable of, right? So that's, for me, that's one of the things that I definitely see Tolkien doing there is, if you have this kind of small idealized group, with simple desires, I would say simple, pure, or pure desires, that when that's brought into conversation with cultures, where there are different priorities, right? So when you have the mechanization, right, where you have Saruman is right, kind of this kind of stereotypical industrialist, and there, his concerns and what he's doing is on the a real contrast to what the hobbits are doing, and they're living in nature, right, and just kind of sustaining themselves off of what they can, not even what they can farm, because they're not like turning themselves into large scale farmers. It's just, small plots of land, exactly what they need. And then seeing how the others, stripping the land for more than they could ever use themselves. So putting those cultures into conflict, into conversation with each other, you see them underestimating the hobbits, right? That there's no way that these hobbits would be any sort of threat because they are so simple. But that's, again, challenging the perspective, challenging the assumptions of some of the people in positions of power, from the villain's end, right? So their whole plan is that having a hobbit take the ring to Mordor is something that Sauron would never expect, because of Sauron's assumptions about what is brave, who is courageous, and the idea that just kind of like a full frontal fight, and the assumption that they would want to possess the ring for themselves. That's just completely turned on its head by the Hobbits' culture of, in a sense, it's a quest to give something away. It's a quest to empty oneself. And you see that in different traditions as well. But I think that's a big one of the largest things from the antagonist to the protagonist side. But then you also see that within the protagonists themselves, how the hobbits challenge, the dwarves, the elves, and the humans' sense of like what is good, what's worth fighting for, what's worth enjoying in life, and what is life at its core. So I really like seeing that. I think Tolkien's doing some interesting things there with that sense of scale with the other characters and how they view it.
I think it's also important politically. So thinking about it as an examination of power, that they would not have been able to agree on anybody else carrying the ring. So Hobbiton, the Shire is kind of Switzerland. It's small enough so they don't actually stand to gain. They cannot, Frodo does actually finally succumb, but even if he earlier on said, right, I'm going to put the ring on, his power would be improportionate to his size, and he'd be squashed like a bug by Sauron pretty quickly, because he doesn't have, magic like Galadriel or Gandalf. So he knows that. He knows that, although of course the temptation is there. But what he does have is resilience, and it's mentioned a couple of times by Gandalf that this small race of people with their feet on the ground, people of the earth, they're able to resist that power, and that must be partly to do with the fact that the temptation is not so huge. If Aragorn could put it on and solve the problems, he could march in and turn over the Dark Tower and all the rest of it, but then was set up as the next tyrant. The hobbits are outside that cycle, and it's part of their smallness and modesty and their limited ambition that actually makes them like that. And I think that's really that's canny. As a good way of showing up the politics and having a joint enterprise that they can all get behind. When I was thinking about this, though, because I think we all sort of know that about the hobbits, but it did remind me that actually in the first book, in The Hobbit, they don't spend much time in environments where Bilbo is anything then slightly shorter than everybody else, because he's traveling with dwarves, and they go to a world with goblins, which doesn't seem, but they seem relatively similar scale. And the only place where it really gets noticeable, the scale is different, is at Bjorn's house. That's like the moment where everything is bigger. And I think Bjorn is bigger anyway. So he's like the equivalent of a giant. Right. And I think the scale aspect is much less relevant in The Hobbit than it is in Lord of the Rings. It fulfills a different function. He's like the junior, like the little brother who goes along with the dwarves, as opposed to being, significantly smaller than everybody else.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I think the intended audience is, I think, at least one of the explanations for that, right? So if the Hobbit has its genesis in stories to his children, they would be more interested in adventures with other creatures, smaller creatures, and how robust this world of the smaller folks can be, as opposed to Lord of the Rings, which certainly skews more adult and definitely brings in more of this kind of adultish concerns of politics, of economy, of culture, of all those different things. So I think that's a great observation.
So just to sort of wrap it up, because often people listening to this are maybe writing their own stories or screenplays or whatever. I'm just thinking about the artistic challenge of smallness and scale. And I think one of the things that came to me is it is so much easier to do it in a book than it is to do it in a film or on stage. Because I think that we have got so many examples of this scale that our imagination immediately connects to, that it's definitely out there as a technique to use. And obviously special effects are making it easier to do, and animation makes it easier to do in film. But I think I wouldn't shy away from it as a writer if you thought that it would be helpful to use this scale issue, thinking of its possibilities. I think it certainly in writing, it's definitely out there as a fantasy trope. And we haven't explored the world of sci-fi. But for example, there was a recent, I'm trying to think of it's by the Chinese writer, what's it called? Trying to remember its title. I'll have to Google its title.
Three-Body Problem.
Three-Body Problem. That's right. I don't want to plot spoil it too much, but it does suggest that an alien invasion might be on a different scale from what we're expecting. And that was quite okay. It's quite a turnaround for thinking of it like that. So I think it's great fun to play around with in fiction. And though there is the issue about it being associated with something childish and childlike, which I'm not sure is totally, it's not easy to get away from that, I don't think. One area we haven't really covered is, of course, dwarves, like Viking kind of dwarves versus people of smaller stature, with dwarfism as an issue and how they are used. But perhaps we should have a whole different section on that side of it. We'll stick to the hobbits this time, because I think that's a big issue to unpack about prejudice in the past and all sorts of things. Okay, so Jacob, as you know, I always ask you to decide where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something. And this time, of course, it has to be where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to be small. Where would you go?
Oh, yeah. And I can't, it's not fair to say Hobbiton. So,
well, let's just agree Hobbiton is kind of, we both want to go there. So
that's just, we'll put it out there. The second, we'll say, what's the second best place? It seems, and this is, I have a hard time like really wrapping my head around a single particular place. Because
I've got an answer which we haven't come up with yet. It may spark some thoughts in you. which is the Nutcracker. I'm talking about the Hoffman story as opposed to the ballet. And that does play with scale. And in that story, I think her name's Maria, she enters into the miniature world of the Christmas tree. And the Christmas tree then becomes a vast world that she can climb up and go and visit the sugar palaces and the world of the animals, and which relates to all the ornaments on the Christmas tree. And there's something very magical and very German about that. A bit of German folk culture going on there. So I think the world of the Nutcracker would be a really fascinating place to be small in, because you have to be small to enter it.
I said it has to be a single fantasy location. Then I would say Wonderland.
Yes, because you would be small to get in through the door. Yeah.
Right. And then for the world that opens up within that, just for its pure inventiveness and the scope of imagination specific, because it's so many places. It's the natural world that we live in, but just seen from a smaller perspective. And it shows you, in a sense, it kind of renews your sense of wonder of the natural world and where you live. But if a fantasy, specifically fantasy location, Wonderland would have to be my answer.
I will accept that answer. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And if we've missed out your favorite story about smaller people, there's so many out there, do let us know. And anything you want to draw our attention to for future conversations. Also, we're very eager to pick up on your suggestions. But for today, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.